Thank you very much, Steve. So as Steve said, we're going to go over today not only what Azure App Services is, but hosting WordPress on it, as well as implementing an auto-renewing SSL certificate so that you can have your SSL without having to worry about re-upping a certificate every year or setting up scripts to do it for you to have it be done. So to give a little bit about myself, as Steve said, I'm a customer engineer at Microsoft. My main area of focus has been Azure DevOps Services and .NET development. I have been working with WordPress for well over 15 years. I said close to 20 years. My math was a little bit off there. It's been more like 17. So it's been a while, but it's definitely been a fun ride for sure. As you can see on the right, I am married and I have with 4 kids, as well as I live on a farm now, and we have 12 pets total. We have 6 cats that you can see here and 4 dogs. And then additionally that are not pictured, we have a rabbit and a chinchilla. And if you have any questions about what it's like owning a chinchilla, I'm happy to share. He is by far our longest living family pet, and he is a wonderful creature. All right, so let's begin with what is Azure App Services. So Azure App Services is essentially a platform as a service offer. It is a global offering that can be hosted in any number of regions, which means that if you have a WordPress website that you need to have hosted in multiple different countries, it supports you being able to spin that up and have it be in the region that you are having your users access the site from. In addition, it supports any number of languages. Here, all we really care about is PHP, but it does support Python, .NET, Java, all of those. So some of the other things to touch on is there are over 50 connectors for enterprise systems, so like SAP or Oracle, that you can connect to through app services. This allows you to go in and really customize and interact with other offerings that you have, as well as other applications. There are a number of SDKs available for interacting with Azure App Services, as well as an API and command line interface. And finally, the last thing to really touch on is one of the nice things with Azure App Services is we have rigorous security and compliance standards that we implement as part of Azure App Service. And these follow along a number of different compliances, and you automatically get those just by having your WordPress site on Azure App Services. So the way Azure App Services work is every Azure App Service website will have an Azure App Service plan that goes along with it. This plan is essentially what represents the compute resources that are available to all your websites that are hosted on that plan. Now, with that, you can have any number of websites on an individual plan. The thing to keep in mind there is, as with any computer or computing, the more websites that you put on it, the more taxing it will be on the resources. So the higher resources you need, or you need to split out into multiple plans. There are a number of different plan options available. They start off with a free plan, where if you want to get your feet wet and throw up a website, you can throw up a website for free. It has a limited number of compute minutes per day, as well as per month. That limits you to really what you can do with it, but it gives you a good playground to really get to know and understand how it works. And on the reverse end of that, we have app service environment. And so an app service environment is a isolated system or app service so that it is completely separated from any other hardware that is on in the data center. It is completely isolated, both network and uh, from the rest of the network. There are ways to introduce connections into the Azure to app service environment. This is really something that is at the enterprise level. It is very, again, costly just due to the fact that you do have dedicated resources that are physically in a data center that are being used for that. Okay. So some of the advantages of Azure App Services. The main one is that it is very scalable. So you are easily able to scale up or scale out based on your needs at the time. So whether you need to implement a server with more memory and more processing power, or if you need to add in an additional server, essentially, or an additional pool that will take on some of the user load. And this can be done either via manual scale or automatic scaling. And some of the rules that can be placed on the automatic scale, there's a number of different ones that you can put into place. The main one that I see done most frequently is CPU percentage. Say a CPU on one of your app services gets over 90%, you want to spin up a new app service to start taking off some of the load off of that one. One of the great benefits of Azure App Services is you only pay for what you use, meaning you're only charged while your site is running. If you don't have it set up to always be on, when the site goes idle, it will go offline essentially and spin back up next time there is a request, but you will not be charged for that time that it is essentially offline waiting for the next request to come in. And then some of the other benefits that go along with this is with some of the higher up plans, so the standard or higher plans, you have the ability to do staging or deployment slots. And this lets you do essentially a staging deployment or a blue-green deployment to where you can have two different versions of your website out there so that you can test one before it goes into the actual production slot. And this allows you to easily swap them out when you're ready to go to take the staging slot to the production slot. And I could go on and on about deployment slots. There's a lot to get into that. So I know this is probably hard, probably difficult to understand exactly how the deployment slots work, but it really is just a way of essentially having multiple versions of your WordPress site or your site running at the same time, and you can control what percentage of traffic or how traffic is routed between those sites. And then one of the next things that is great about this is the monitoring that is built into all of Azure's resources. So you get a lot of great information about how your web app service is performing, whether it is running a lot of high CPU usage, running a lot of memory, or if there's a lot of requests coming in. You can see a ton of different details. One of the other things that you can do is you can set up alerts to email you or text message you when certain criteria is met. So say you have over 500 errors come in within 5 minutes. You can set that up as a criteria to send out a notification to get some human interaction involvement with it. And again, with the standard and higher plans, there is automatic backups. And you can go in and define how frequently these backups occur and how long they are retained. It is great to have a backup in case you have an issue come up or you accidentally make a change that broke your site, and it is easier to restore from a backup than trying to fix what you might have broke. What are some of the downsides of Azure App Services? I can't talk about all the benefits without talking about some of the negatives. So one of the negatives that I found kind of personally frustrating when I first started moving my WordPress websites over to Azure was that send mail, the function, the PHP function, is disabled inside of Azure App Services. This is done as part of a prevention to try and prevent abuse. Essentially, what that means is that you have to install a plugin or go through another method of overriding the built-in WordPress functionality to use SMTP, or in my recommendation, you can use SendGrid. So SendGrid is a way to send out emails simply using an API, and it makes it a lot easier to really pass in information, because instead of passing in username and password into an SMTP information, you're just passing an API key, and that API key has certain authorizations to what it can do. And so that's why I recommend SendGrid, is it really has a lot of flexibility, and the security is great on it to really prevent abuse. And one of the other great things about it is it can authenticate with your domain so that your emails are coming as though they are authenticated as part of the domain. I don't remember exactly how that works. I just know that it makes a huge difference when your emails are coming through from SendGrid, because it shows the email programs essentially that you are verified. One of the other big pieces that to note about the difference between Azure App Service and other, hosting plans that are out there is the cost difference. There are quite a few hosts out there, a lot of economy hosts that are really inexpensive and really easy to put a WordPress website on, or put multiple WordPress websites on. Unfortunately, with a always on configuration or very active website, you're going to have that cost incurred throughout the month or throughout the entire month, which generally would lead to a higher cost than comparable hosting on another platform, with regards to some of your economy hosting that is out there. One of the other things to note is the MySQL server. Depending on how you run MySQL server, there's also an additional cost associated with that. Running my own personal WordPress blogs, the MySQL server is the majority of the cost per month. The actual app service plans are fairly minimal, mostly due to the fact that I don't have very popular websites in WordPress currently, so they don't get a ton of traffic. And then one of the other downsides I kind of touched on previously is that when your site goes idle, it will be shut down so that you're not being charged for the processing that you're not using. However, when you first come back to access that website, there is an initial spin up time that will be incurred for starting up the application. And this goes with any applications that you have, not only just with starting up the app service itself to run the WordPress site, but getting WordPress up and running and actually getting the website responsive. So getting started with Azure App Services, the first thing you need is a Azure account with an active subscription associated with it. And one of the easy ways to do this is to go through and create a new account, or what is called a free account, through the Azure website. With this, any new accounts get a $200 credit that they're able to use for the first 30 days. So that gives you an ability to kind of play around and really understand what things are going to cost, and understand how best to utilize resources prior to really actually putting in your credit card information and being charged every month for the processing that you're using. But when talking about creating a WordPress website on Azure App Service, there is two main ways to go about doing that. The first of which is there is a WordPress template in the marketplace that will create all the resources necessary for you, as well as deploy the WordPress code to the app service for you. This gives you a great starting point if you're creating a new site from scratch and are not wanting to use an existing app service plan or something else that's already out there. The other option that is there is to create the resources manually. So the previous step creates the same resources that you would create in this second step. It is just a matter of you have to go through and create two different resources rather than going through one individual screen that then creates the two resources. This is the first screen that you go through for creating it from the template. As you can see here, there's really not a whole lot of information you have to fill out. You give it a region, you give it a resource group and a subscription. Those are pieces that you have to go through any Azure resource. All resources in Azure have those three pieces. And you give it a name, and then you choose whether you want it to be hosted on Linux or Windows. My recommendation is Linux. And then you get to choose a hosting tier. And so this is not quite the experience that you would get from the other option UI because it doesn't really give you as much control over what processing or what app service plan you are really picking. And then finally, you have some WordPress settings that it collects. It collects a username, an email, and then a password to create the initial user account for setting up the initial WordPress website. On the right, you can see the highlighted pieces are the pieces that this template automatically named. So you can see that it creates a new app service plan and automatically names it and chooses what its name is going to be. And it bases it based on the resource group and then uses just a random set of characters. So it's really a little bit hard to understand exactly what what it's going for there. And then again, the same thing goes with the MySQL server. At the bottom, you can see that it creates the server name and the database name automatically using the name of your website and then adding in some random character or some random numbers and then a tag. And one of the things that is not circled on here is the username and password. So these are the database administrator username and password. It's very important at this point in time that you copy those pieces down and store them somewhere, as the only thing that you can do with those credentials after the fact is reset them, which can cause a lot of difficulty if you have a lot of pieces that use it. So with the first method, once you go through this UI and click create, it's really just a few clicks and then you have your WordPress site up and running. Problems with this method is that the WordPress version that you get is generally out of date. When I was playing with this just yesterday, the WordPress version that was installed was 5.7. Obviously, that's not a big deal because the first thing that you can do is update, but it is something to keep note of. One of the other pieces is that I ran into multiple issues creating these resources from this template. In fact, I was only successful about half the time in actually creating the WordPress website. The other times, something would go wrong with the deployment, the resources, the server. There's a number of different things that could go wrong. And again, like I mentioned on the last screen, you have no control over the names of the app service plan or the MySQL database information or server information. And this can be very problem causing if you have things that are named very similar. And in my playing around with this yesterday, it did actually create 2 app service plans that have nearly identical names just because they were in the same resource group. Then the final point here is that when you are using the template, it does pigeonhole you into creating a new app service plan and creating a new MySQL database resource. If you are wanting to simply add a new website, this is not something that you'd want to do because you don't necessarily want to create a new app service plan when you can already use an existing one you have. That's where the second method comes in. So the second method requires you to go to these 2 different screens, one to create the MySQL server, and then the other one to create the web app. Creating the MySQL server goes through and you have all the control. You pick where the server is going to be located, what you want your compute settings to be, basically how expensive of a MySQL server you want to be running, and then you give it your admin username and password. Similar on the right, we have the create web app. Again, you give it a name, you give it a region, and then you pick your runtime stack. In this instance, you can see that I'm picking PHP 8.0. Again, you can pick, there's a number of different options here for PHP, as well as the other different runtime stacks that you can have. And then, of course, the choice between Linux or Windows, because this web app was being created against my WordPress existing plan. It didn't have the option of being a Windows app service because it was on a Linux plan. So that is why the Windows one in this instance is disabled. The problem is once you create these resources, this is what you get. You get the nice default landing page for your new app service. It's great. You've got an app service out there. Now you have to do something with it. The first thing you have to do is you need to configure the MySQL server for connections both from other Azure resources and from your local machine. This allows you to connect to the server from your local machine, and it also allows your app service to then communicate with your MySQL server. These are 2 very important steps in getting your WordPress site up and running, just due to the fact that if you don't have that little toggle flipped, it can be very confusing why your WordPress website is not communicating with your database. So after you have your WordPress MySQL server set up, you go into your app service and you locate your FTP credentials. So this allows you to go in. Every app service has a deployment center where you can go in and view the FTP credentials for logging in and modifying the website through FTP. You can also give it a publish profile. This is something that can be used from Visual Studio to deploy code via some other options through Azure DevOps Services CI/CD. You can do deployments to app services pretty seamlessly. This would be great if you want to have your WordPress core files in Git. But again, once you have to go in and get the FTP user information. This is not something that you generate. This is generated for you. The username is unique as well as the password. And then you can use any FTP client of your choice and copy over, and then you will copy over the WordPress files and you get a WordPress website. It is very simple then to go from there and configuring the WordPress website to use the settings that you set up in the previous steps. So the database name, the database username, database password, all of that information that you would set up with any regular WordPress website. So what are some of the recommendations? Some of the recommendations for hosting WordPress on Azure App Services is to make use of some of the other Azure offerings that are out there. And one of those is Azure Storage. You can utilize Azure Storage to store your files that are hosted in WordPress in Azure Storage instead of hosting inside of the app service plan itself. This gives you pretty much unlimited storage power for hosting your media files. It also gives you the ability to set up a Azure CDN to access those media files as static content and deliver it as part of a content delivery network. The next recommendation is you want to make sure that when you are creating multiple resources like your MySQL server and your app service plan, you want to create them in the same region. This is just a general practice to reduce the latency between communications. There's nothing stopping you from creating a MySQL server on the East Coast and the app service plan on the West Coast. It just would create a decent amount of latency between your calls. One of the other things to note is the monitoring that is built in and setting up alerts. Additionally, you can also set up application insights. There is a plugin for that I've been playing around with. It gives you some additional logging information and additional insight into what's going on with your application from the client side. And finally, the piece that we're going to touch on a little bit more fully is enforcing or requiring SSL. So nowadays, with search engines are really focused on SEO and the trustworthiness of a website. With that, search engines do put priority over websites that have SSL versus ones that do not, especially ones that are e-commerce sites, etc., where you would need SSL to have a secure transaction. With Azure App Services, getting a SSL certificate is very easy and free to set one up for any custom subdomain. So the first step in setting up your custom SSL for your Azure App Service is to go in and create your custom domain. Your custom domain has to be a subdomain. You cannot do the root domain. It will not allow you to create an app service certificate for your root domain or a wildcard. You have to create it for a specific subdomain that is what your app service is serving. Here you can see I just used the good old www prefix for my domain. And this allows me to set up the certificate for this URL. And one of the great things about going about it this way is that you don't have to have your domain hosted in Azure, and it doesn't have to be an Azure domain. You can have your domain literally hosted anywhere. It is just a matter of going in and adding in your custom domain verification ID in the correct place. So once you have your custom domain added, you go into the SSL settings and you go into create a app service managed certificate. There is simply a button you click on, and then you select your binding that you want to create a app service managed certificate for. In this instance, you can see I'm selecting my www subdomain. It gives the indication that it is eligible and available to create the certificate. It is simple. Then at this point, you just click create. It will create the certificate for you, and then you'll see the update there at the bottom in your private key certificates for your app service. You'll be able to see when they expire, the host name that they're for, as well as the thumbprint. The expiration date is really informational. When you use an app service managed certificate, it is renewed automatically, so it is not something that you ever have to worry about. As you can see here, my expiration date on my certificate when I initially set it up and made these images was back in September. If I were to go to it now, it is currently June. That is the June 2022. That is the current expiration date. That's because it's been auto-renewed a couple times since then. And on that note, with the renewal period, the certificates do not last as long as typical certificates. I cannot remember if it's 3 or 6 months, but they do not last the full year. And that is just to keep them fresh and, again, keep abuse to a minimum. Once you have your certificate imported into your app service, you go back into your custom domains, click on your domain name, and click on Add Binding under SSL Bindings. It's very simple. Again, here you simply select the subdomain that you're picking, the certificate that you want to connect to it, and then the SSL type. For all purposes here, your only real option is SNI, unless you have a dedicated environment with a dedicated IP address. And once you have all these settings done, it is the recommendation that you turn on HTTPS and enforce it so that it only allows traffic from HTTPS connections and will redirect any HTTP connection to your HTTPS. This ensures that all traffic coming to your website goes through your SSL and ensures that your search engines will have more trust in your website as a secure website that will be protective of its users' informations. And with that, that is all I had. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. You certainly made it sound easy to set up WordPress on Azure, so thank you. We have 2 questions. Mal asked if you can use PHP MyAdmin with Azure.
It's a good question. I don't know. I would have to look into that. I don't know what underlying OS interactions it has with regards to that, but it might not work.
Okay. All right. And I don't know if you know this either. John was asking about cost per month in terms of, like, if you went with Azure Storage and CDN, what is the minimum are you looking for? Looking at to set up a site?
I mean, it all is really based on the amount of traffic that your site gets. My personal blogs, I'm looking at probably about $40 a month for the MySQL server, and that's upgraded MySQL server. And then the website, the app service plans themselves, it's maybe like $15 a month for its utilization, and that's with it being almost always on. So the real big cost is the MySQL, and that is because the MySQL database kind of has to always be on, just due to the way that it is configured. So there's always going to be a cost associated with that and storing that data.
Okay. Well, I'm just curious, why any particular reason why you upgraded your server? I mean, have you increased traffic, or are you running something that requires a stronger server?
I upgraded mostly out of curiosity to start with, and then I noticed a huge performance jump. I was using an economy host, so I was hosted on a web server that probably had hundreds of other websites on it, and so I wanted to get off of that and to have more dedicated resources available to my application, especially because I ran into several instances with that shared host where my website went down because someone else caused an issue on that server.
Yeah, we've been talking about shared hosting for years at this meetup. $5 hosts, $10 hosts, things like that. Yeah. Can you integrate? Thad's asking, can you integrate Azure DevOps with your site?
Yes, you can, and it is seamless. It is very easy to integrate with Azure App Services and create a deployment to there. To set it up for like a WordPress website, it would take probably just a few minutes.
Oh, nice. All right. Anyone else? Any other questions for Michael? Anyone? Going once, going twice. And again, this has been recorded. So if you want to review it step by step, it'll be on YouTube. Yeah, that's it. No more questions. Oh, one more. AWS has WordPress cloud hosting offerings. Jeff is asking Azure versus AWS light sale. Is there anything can you speak about that, or not really?
I don't have much experience with light sale, unfortunately, so I don't really know how to compare it, how to compare the two.
Okay.
It might be easier over there. There are quite a few hosts out there, I'm sure that you're all aware, that make setting up a WordPress website very easy to entice you to get on there. But it may not be the best.
I would second that. Actually, I've seen other hosts with that one-click WordPress install, and it just ends up installing lots of additional stuff you don't need, and you don't get to configure WordPress the way you want to. So I would second that. I've seen that. All right. I think that's it, Michael. Thank you so much. I appreciate the presentation. Again, you made it look real easy.
It is fairly easy once you get the hang of it and go through the process of setting it up once or twice. After I set up the first couple of my blogs moving over, it really got into a quick process of just moving the sites over one by one.